What's up, gentlemen? I have lived on three different continents: Europe, Latin America, although that's not really a continent, and Southeast Asia, which, once again, more of an area than a continent. But I'm going to be ranking them from best to worst in multiple different categories. We're going to be talking cost of living, quality of life, safety, dating, and a whole lot more. So if this interests you, make sure to stay tuned. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and just jump right in. And we are going to start with most people's probably number one consideration. Although for me, it is not the number one consideration. The number one consideration for me would be quality of life slash value for money, which we will touch upon shortly. But most people are going to go with cost of living for obvious reasons. So, as it relates to cost of living, this is tricky because obviously we are talking about large areas of land here. So, we're talking about places like Argentina, we're talking Mexico, and all those countries in between. There are going to be vastly different costs of living, there's going to be vastly different safety standards. And so, I'm going to give you a generalization for all of these things that we are going to be comparing. Like, for example, weather. How are you going to compare the weather in Portugal or Greece to the weather in Estonia or Sweden? So, like I said, it's kind of going to be a weighted average for a lot of these categories. So, as it relates to cost of living, here is what I will say: dollar for dollar, the best cost of living is in Southeast Asia, whether that is Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, doesn't matter. By far, the place with the lowest cost of living is going to be Southeast Asia. Then you're probably going to get into Latin America. And then finally, the most expensive on the whole is going to be Europe. If I had to separate Western Europe from Eastern Europe to Scandinavia, this video would get way too long. But generally, Western Europe is going to be a bit more expensive, while the Eastern and Central parts of Europe going to be a bit more affordable. The northern parts of Europe also tend to be a little bit more expensive as well. So that's a general breakdown. But on the whole, as it relates to cost of living, it's going to be Southeast Asia, then Latin America, then you're going to have Eastern Europe slash Central Europe, then you're going to have Western Europe, and then you're probably going to have the Nordics, although there are certainly good places in Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy to get a pretty low cost of living. Now, that kind of brings me into another thing that is going to tie into quality of life, and that is safety. And as it relates to safety, here is what I'd say. The safest area, in my personal opinion, I do not know the statistics, is going to be, on average, Southeast Asia. Then it's probably going to be Europe, and then the least safe, probably Latin America. Once again, this is based on my experience. This is not based on the raw data or things like that, because I've talked about this on this channel before, that the raw data doesn't really tell you that much because, for example, if you live in the nicest areas of certain places in Latin America, you're really not in danger. And in Mexico, for example, a lot of the danger happens in places that there are cartel wars. There's cartel on cartel violence. And unless you plan on starting a cartel or beefing with a cartel, probably not going to have any issues. But I would say that pickpocketing, burglary, robbery, that kind of stuff, probably a little bit higher in Latin America. And I would say you are safest in Southeast Asia. So far, that would be 2 points, I guess, if you want to use a point system for Southeast Asia, then Europe, and then in last place, you have Latin America. This takes me to the third thing, which is quality of life slash lifestyle slash weather slash value for your money. And once again, this is my opinion, and it really gets super subjective here because we are all looking for different things. We all want different lifestyles. And so here is what I would say for me. For the value for money aspect, it is undoubtedly, without question, I will take this to the bank. I will take it to my grave. Southeast Asia, best value in the world. There's not a city on this planet that your dollar goes as far as it does in Bangkok while also giving you all the first class amenities, luxury amenities, fine dining, great nightlife, and in my opinion, simply a world class city. It is unmatched. You can get great luxury condos for less than $1,000 a month. Then you can go to a fine dining restaurant. Then you can go to some of the best nightlife in the world. It simply has it all. And that rings true throughout most of these places in Southeast Asia. I didn't mention it before, but Malaysia is an excellent value for your money as well. And so, for the value for money equation, I would say the best value is in Southeast Asia, and then it is probably in Latin America. But this is kind of a toss up because the overall lifestyle in Latin America and Europe is completely different. But generally, since you're working with different currencies that are weaker than the US dollar, you're going to get better value for your money in Latin America than you would in Europe. That said, I think the access to elite restaurants is a little bit lacking in most of Latin America, especially in comparison to Europe, because obviously Europe has some of the countries with the most Michelin star restaurants. And I'm not saying Michelin star means all that much, but it does mean something. And the reason I wanted to touch on this is because in a place like Bangkok, your lifestyle is going to be unmatched in comparison to what it would be in Europe. So, with that said, I'm going to actually put Europe in the number two spot for lifestyle because I think there's just so much Europe has to offer. And there's just so many options. You can live the Mediterranean lifestyle, you could be a snowbird, you could live the Nordic lifestyle, you could live the Baltic lifestyle, just so many different options. And I think Europe probably presents the number two option, although I would say that equivalent lifestyles in these three places, by far, pretty much every country in Europe is going to be vastly more expensive than it would be in Asia or Latin America. And while we're on the topic of lifestyle, we should probably touch on healthcare, although I don't have a lot of experience with healthcare because I'm still relatively young. All these places, for the most part, have decent healthcare. I would put Asia in first place. Man, I really don't know between Europe and Latin America because Latin America is probably a little bit more affordable and it probably has comparable technology to what they have in Europe, but I really just don't have a lot of experience. So for this, I'm not going to factor it really into the rankings, but I'm pretty sure Asia would be a runaway number one here. Although I think Latin America does punch pretty far above its weight. Another thing I would say is the food. So, food, Asia has amazing food. You got Vietnamese food, you got Thai food, which are, in my opinion, some of the best cuisines in the world. You got Europe, which has Greek food, which has Italian food. Spanish food's not bad. And I'm sure there's more, but I'm going off the top of my head here. Latin America, you obviously have amazing food. You got amazing Mexican food. You got the amazing Peruvian food. You got the great steaks in Argentina. So for this, it's kind of personal preference, but frankly, I would lean towards Asia and Latin America. But once again, I'm really not going to factor this in because it is so subjective and largely personal preference. Although I will say European food, well, I couldn't say European food because, Greek food massively different than French food. I will say Greek food probably the healthiest option on here because the food in some of these other places are loaded with sugars and calories and things like that. Kind of like Italian pasta is just loaded with carbs, right? So that is something to be aware of. And then next up, let's talk about the language barrier in these places because that might be a consideration slash overall expat lifestyle considerations, I would say. So, can you meet other expats? You'll be able to meet expats in any of these places. So, none of them really are runaway winners or losers. Once again, you're grouping large territories together. So, are you going to see as many expats in Mexico as you would see in Cambodia. Obviously not. But that is once again a great reason as to why I am using generalizations. So, with that said, I would say the lowest language barrier probably going to be in Asia or Europe because so many people, especially in Southeast Asia, speak English, especially when you're talking Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, even Malaysia. So you really aren't going to have much of a language barrier. Now, if you threw like Japan and China in there, then yeah, this would be no contest. Those would be some of the worst places to go for language barrier. Europe, once again, tons of people in Europe speak English. In fact, when I was in, I don't remember where I just was. It was before I went to Spain this previous time. I went somewhere and there were two Europeans, maybe a German, and let's just pick somewhere else. Let's go with Ukrainian. I don't remember actually where they were. It might have been Italian, but whatever. They were on the bus by each other and they were talking to each other and they're like trying to figure each other out, and then they just switched to English. And that's kind of why I say there's not much of a language barrier in Europe, because even amongst Europeans, when they want to communicate with each other, oftentimes they'll switch to English. Or, for example, when I dated an Italian girl who was living in Spain, she lived with a bunch of other university students, and they would converse in English. Although they were all working on their Spanish, and Spanish kinda, somewhat, not really similar to Italian, but c'est la vie. Point being, plenty of people in Europe speak English, so not going to be much of a language barrier. Now, in Latin America, a lot more hit or miss. So that's why I would put it in the lowest spot for this, because although Spanish isn't hard to learn, and I would recommend learning at least passable Spanish or whatever language that would be applicable to wherever you go, a lot of the Latin American countries don't have the highest level of English proficiency. So that may cause a problem for you as it relates to the language barrier if you do not have even the most basic of Spanish skills. Now, finally, we're going to tie this all together with dating. And this is once again super, super subjective. And I put it purposefully after language barrier because that is a consideration you are going to need to make. If you go to Latin America with no Spanish skills, do you think a Latin woman who doesn't speak English is going to want to date you? Maybe, but is that going to be something long term? Do you think you're going to be able to marry someone who can't communicate with you? Are you going to rely on Google Translate your entire relationship on all of your dates? Eh, I don't think that is the best idea. So, if you don't speak basic Spanish and you're not searching out women who speak English, then I would say Latin America, probably not the best place to date. But in my personal opinion, here is how I would personally rank it. Number one, I would say Latin America, by far my favorite place. The women are absolutely beautiful. They're simply my type. They're fun, engaging, friendly, energetic. I can't say enough things about them positively. They are by far the most fun women in the entire world to be around, bar none. I've been to over 70 different countries. Nothing even comes close to Latino women. Next up, this is incredibly, incredibly difficult because Europe, once again, massive area of land, and the women are vastly different from country to country. So, what I would say here is, on average, I would prefer Southeast Asia because the women are super friendly, super feminine, super engaging, although they are a bit shy and a bit more reserved, I guess, is the best way I could put it. The thing with the Asian women, in my personal opinion, they just aren't all that attractive on the whole, in my opinion. Yes, you can find attractive women wherever you go, but for me, I would say Asian women are some of the best women on the planet everywhere except for when it comes to actual physical beauty, which is arguably one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, to 99.99% of guys, which is why I've said numerous times that although dating in Thailand is easy, there's tons of options, and frankly, it is a good marketplace. It's not necessarily my favorite marketplace, and that's why I'm incredibly transparent in these videos when I say, hey, I love Thailand. Thailand's great. You're going to have plenty of options. It's a booming dating marketplace. I don't think the women are that attractive. I think they are attractive enough, but I'm not going to say they're like top tier. And if you've watched any of my content before, I have said numerous times the best women in Asia in general are going to be South Korean for what I like. Now, with that said, let's go back to Europe. Europe, I would say, gets the lowest marks on this list. However, when it comes to, let's say, Central Eastern Europe, it's a little trickier because they are incredibly pretty, they're smart, but I just don't find them to be as fun as Latin American women. And when I mean fun, they just have radically different cultures. So Latin American women, they're like, oh, they hear some music, they start dancing, they're dancing in the kitchen while they're cooking for you, doing all that kind of stuff. They are just such a fun, feminine, friendly energy to be around. Whereas I'm not saying the women in this part of the world aren't fun, it's just a completely different energy. And until you've been around both of them, it's really hard to describe what I'm trying to convey with you. Maybe my vocabulary just isn't large enough. Forgive me for that. But I would definitely place them looks wise, especially in places like Moldova, Ukraine, Serbia, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend that place for dating, as some of the most attractive women in the world. But kind of like how I said, Asian women have everything except for the looks for me. The opposite kind of holds true for most of European women. Most European women have the looks, but then they don't have the other things that these other places have in a psychological way, if you will. Once again, not saying they aren't intelligent or they're not friendly or any of these things. The culture is just radically different. And that's why I would say in Central/Eastern Europe, it ranks higher than a place like Western Europe on the whole because they have a little bit different mentality, but I find they aren't as friendly and fun and energetic and warm as the Western European women. Like Italian women, incredibly warm and can't speak enough great things about them. But anyway, I think that's going to wrap up the video. I wasn't keeping track of the points, so you would probably have to let me know in the comments down below as to who the winner is. But if I had to go off of just like gut feeling and what I think, I'm thinking Asia probably ran away with the rankings because it's going to rank so highly in pretty much all these categories. And three of the most important is going to be cost of living, safety, and quality of life, which I think it probably ranked number one in all of those. The big drawback, obviously, is going to be the fact that if you don't like the warm weather, that's going to be a problem. If you don't like the Asian women and you're a single guy, that's going to be a problem. And the time zone could be a massive problem as well, which we didn't get into for the purpose of this video, but that could have been a consideration for you. So once again, I just went through a few different categories here. And these are ones that I find to be some of the most important because I think there are workarounds to being in a suboptimal time zone. But like I said, we're all different, and you may have something on this list like proximity to family, which might rank super high for you, whereas I really don't care. So, with all that said, I think we're going to wrap up this video here. I'll see you guys in the next video. And as always, peace, much love.